Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to a Kidlit Pride sponsored panel. Today's panel is Beyond the Binary with some very exciting authors that will introduce themselves in a moment. But for right now, I am your panel moderator. My name is Alex Abraham. I am a children's bookseller based out of Boston, and I love to talk about books on Twitter. So this is really fun for me.
I'm Anna-Marie McLemore. My pronouns are they, them. I am a queer Latinx non-binary author who writes queer Latinx non-binary fairy tales, including, let's see if I can do this and not drop any of these, When the Moon Was Ours, Wild Beauty, Blanca y Roja, and most recently, Dark and Deepest Red. And I'm very excited to be here.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Oshiro. I am a queer, non-binary Latinx person. I use the pronouns they, them, or he, him. Alternately, though I prefer they, them these days. I'm the author of Anger is a Gift, which is my first novel, and coming out in less than 2-3 months, I don't know how time works, is Each of Us a Desert, which is my fantasy follow-up to Anger is a Gift. And I write about queer people of color all the time, and it's great. I love it.
Hi, everyone. My name is A.J Sass. I write under my initials AJ. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. And I am the author of Anna on the Edge, which is a middle grade contemporary novel. It is about a competitive ice skater who is navigating a non-binary gender identity both on and off the ice. And it is out on October 20th.
Yay!
Okay, hi, I'm Mia Siegert. It's confusing with pronouns. I identify as queer and bigender. That means that there's really a firm line. It's something that kind of go through a little bit, where some days I am very male, some days very female. There is no interlap. It's very confusing. Today I would be using he, him pronouns. I am definitely made up because I have family members coming over and it's a very strange situation. But if they're online, I don't mind online. It's really difficult to tell. So any pronoun online, I'm fine with. I just had my second book, Somebody Told Me, come out, which I believe is the first one with a bigender protagonist in young adult. So that was very exciting for me. But most people know me for Jerkbait because, you know, gay hockey novel. But really with COVID and everything, I hope you guys consider my little bigender wonderful book where a bigender kid goes and kicks patriarchy's butt.
Yes.
Yay!
I did just realize I didn't give my own pronouns, which is like #1 moderator mistake. So I'm doing a really good job. I hope everybody watching realizes that we all make mistakes, and it's a little nerve-wracking to know that you're being recorded. So I use they, them, or she, her pronouns interchangeably. Both are fine. Thank you guys for being here. So this is a very exciting panel because obviously, with everything going on with COVID-19 and just general sort of health and safety regulations that have been put into place, not a lot of book conventions that typically happen over the summer or in the late spring are going to be happening. And so I know even just for me personally, I don't really leave the East Coast, but there were a ton of events I was planning on going to that I could not go to anymore. So that alone makes it exciting to do panels like this, but the fact that we can have a Pride Kidlit panel that is accessible to anyone as long as they have an internet connection is really, really exciting. And the fact that we can have a panel in that Pride Kidlit umbrella that just focuses on writing as non-binary writers for non-binary readers is also very exciting. So just wanted to talk that up a little bit. I think the people at Kidlit Pride have been doing just a really amazing, fantastic job. So shout out to all of those lovely people. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so to kick us off, I wanted to ask y'all, what does writing beyond the binary, that phrase, mean to you? Like, how do you interpret that in your own writing?
I'll start. Initially, so it's interesting too because this is, you know, my first Pride out as non-binary. Which I'm very excited about. It's very thrilling to get to like live your truth and live as the person you want to be, and feel safe doing that too, which is also another aspect of this that's wonderful. You know, And it's something that I have talked about for years. Privately, I started coming out years ago to people, and only recently felt like, okay, this is the time to like be public about this, and it was very exciting. That being said, I still was writing from that place with my first book. I feel very lucky that I landed with a publisher and an editor and with a marketing team. I received no pushback about having one of my main character's best friends be someone who was non-binary, and not just non-binary, but I was writing from this place of wanting a character who was never gendered at all. There's no sense of like, you don't know what gender they were assigned at birth. The text never genders them at all. It's all, and not just in pronouns, but the way other people look at them and talk about them and the way their clothing is. And like, in a way, it was like a power fantasy. It was like, this is what I would like the world to be like. Like, it would be great if the world just did this by default. And then with Each of Us a Desert, to elevate that in different ways, where I designed a religion around a god that has no gender, and you're not allowed to gender the god at all. It's like a whole thing, and it was really exciting to do that. And so from that place, I think like I want to get to Mia's level. Like, I want to write a character where the main character, or like AJ, like that's the goal. Like, is at what point do I feel comfortable where I can write a protagonist that's closer to who I am. So right now I see this as like, I'm trying to figure out my own identity and then taking baby steps through art, where I think art has this wonderful ability to be this avenue where you can actually start to talk about yourself.
Can I just go and comment on that, since you mentioned me too?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I think is so important, especially with having a main character be non-binary, but then also talking about really a non-binary sort of genderless god in your book. I've not yet been able to read. I apologize. I'm
Yeah, it's fine. It's not even out, so
Well, arcs and everything. Yeah. But one of the things that it made me think about, and especially just with queer and people of color, was the revival of What's on This Island on Broadway, where they decided that Papa Gay would be played by presumably, I believe, cis woman, and Mama Yurley is played by Alex Newell. I'm not sure what pronouns they use. I believe they, them. And that was something that was extraordinary. And their response to it was just like, they're gods. Why do gods have to have a set gender with everything like that? And these four gods. And that was, I thought, just monumental. So then with you mentioning that, it just made me think of like how cool it is with the concept. And I just admire that so much. And I'm so excited to go and read your book. That's going to be so much fun.
I hope this panel is just the four of us just gassing each other up the entire time. It's like, we need this. Like, it's Pride. This is our time.
We do. I don't know, but yeah. Oh, should I go next? I don't know.
Sure. I mean, okay. Yeah, talk about.
Okay. So, with writing beyond the binary, this is a difficult thing, and I'm going to try to skim over some of the hardship, but I don't want to skim too much over that, because I think that some people do need to know the realism of what happened. And I am probably going to get yelled at about this, but a lot of people know about a certain drama that happened with my first publisher, such as my first publisher going under, and then getting bought out, and then maybe not bought out, and then none of us getting paid for 2 years. I was the very last author to get paid in that whole group, which we know because all of the authors talk to each other. So we knew that I was the very last one with that, which also surprised me, because Jerkbait sold out its first print run, I believe they said, in the first 7 days. So I thought that was amazing. And that was huge for like a tiny publisher. And after the fallout from there, it ended up being 4 years between publications. And what happened is that a lot of people weren't ready to take a risk on someone like me. I'd written 2 other manuscripts that were, I think, pretty solid. But it was either, not the market, or love this, and had multiple acquisitions meetings, and we can't figure out how to sell it and, do the next thing. And one of the things that I forget about is that with writing young adult, I've always done the best when I write angry. When I wrote Jerkbait, I was so pissed off. I just started the querying stage with some literary fiction, and I got so pissed off that I couldn't get my foot in the door. I wrote a book in like 3 weeks, and I sent out a query letter. I don't ever do that. And then all of a sudden, immediately, I got like, can you please send the full immediately? And it's like, oh no. It's like, I was just angry. And with somebody told me, I got so angry, and I was trying to write this book about a teen who was overhearing confessions through their bedroom wall. And yes, I know that I completely made up the fact, because yes, with the rectory and the confessional, no, they would not be next to each other. It's fiction. That was something I wanted to do, because I was like, that would be a cool story. And then as I started writing it, it wasn't working. It wasn't working. It wasn't working. And I emailed my agent, Travis Pennington, and I just said, can I have a bigender protagonist? And I don't even know why I did. And he's just like, I fully support you with that. So suddenly, with going and having this bigender protagonist, I was writing it, and it went fast. It was like 6 weeks to completion. We sent it in, and the editors, the response to it was absolutely incredible. And then with ending up with Carol Rhoda, with Amy Fitzgerald, who's my editor, she actually read it in under 2 days. And that was one of the fastest times I'd seen that. But also replies from other editors, and the amount of encouragement they did was amazing. And I had no idea until Dahlia said that it was the first bigender protagonist young adult that she was aware of. So it kind of was terrifying. And my goal from now on is to make sure that I include very clear non-binary characters. I feel a lot of non-binary authors are feeling stuck where we only can write that. So I want to just make sure that also readers know that we can write outside of our version of binary, but at the same time expect us to use our non-binary selves in it. That's really critical to do. And I'm just going to ask people to cross fingers over the next few months for me, please. So just cross fingers. That's it.
I can go next. So when I was growing up eons ago, the only real media representations of trans people that I saw were like a very straightforward narrative where, usually if it was a child, they said, well, I knew I was X gender from age 2 on. And that wasn't my experience. I kind of had a very slow progression toward realizing my gender identity. I knew I was queer from a really young age, but what letter in the acronym I couldn't quite pin down for a really long time. And a lot of that was because I grew up in kind of a rural location. I didn't have access to resources or other queer people that I could talk to. So I initially started transitioning more on a traditional female to male path. With hormones and all that fun stuff, and I changed my name to a more traditionally male name and started using male pronouns. And for some time, I really felt empowered by that. I knew I didn't identify as a woman, so I thought, well, this is the next best thing is like I'm a little bit more comfortable being seen as a male. But I knew that wasn't the whole story, and I knew a lot of trans friends of mine tried to leave their past behind. They didn't want to acknowledge it, former names, pronouns, and that really wasn't my experience. It wasn't until maybe a couple years ago. I'm in my 30s now, so I started transitioning in my late 20s, and in my early 30s that I heard the term non-binary, and it was just like a light bulb moment for me. And at that point, I've been wanting to be a writer for years, but when I first started thinking about writing, maybe like 12, 15 years ago, there weren't a lot of representations even of cisgender, gay or lesbian characters, let alone bisexual. So I didn't really see a lot of options for me to get traditionally published. But after I did kind of my transition and I came back, I saw so many more options there. And I kind of settled into the middle grade space because I really I love YA too, but I really love the way that these queer characters were portrayed there and how they had like their little romances and their crushes and maybe they got a kiss and stuff. And I saw a couple fantastic stories about trans people in the middle grade space, like George by Alex Gino and Gracefully Grayson by Amy Polanski. And I was like, well, this is fantastic. I love how it's being done. So where's my non-binary character? And I looked everywhere and I hope they're out there, but I couldn't find one in my library. So I actually got kind of pissed off and decided I was going to write one. And with Anna on the Edge specifically, I am a figure skater, so I'm really aware of the gendered elements within the sport and how there really isn't any room for in-betweens. Like you're in the ladies division or you're in the men's division. If you do ice dance, you either do the men's steps or the ladies steps. Even the equipment you wear is very gendered. Like girls wear white or tan skates, boys wear black skates. And I decided I wanted to explore that space with Anna on the Edge because that's what I was growing up with, and trying to figure out what my place was within the sport where, you know, the announcer would announce you by Miss or Mr. as you come out and stuff like that. So, and I also really with Anna, I wanted a situation where the main character didn't have everything figured out by the end of the narrative, because I am still figuring stuff out about myself. So I figured maybe a 12-year-old doesn't have everything figured out either. So I made kind of a clear decision that Anna knew she was non-binary by the end, but hadn't changed pronouns yet. So I'm still using female for her, but understood that maybe at some point in the future, she might change that. So I'm starting to ramble now. But yeah, the most important thing for me was just to let people know that it's okay to change your mind too. If you end up settling on something like I did with male pronouns and a male name, and then realizing that that's not actually your authentic identity, it's okay to tell people that you have actually a different pronoun preference, or this might have been authentic to me 5 years ago. It's not anymore because I've changed. So that was my main goal, and that's why I'm hoping that I can continue to write characters that sort of explore those little nuances within our identities.
I am going to echo some of what's been said about figuring things out about our identities, because I very much resonate with the idea of our identities kind of being a work in progress. That certainly has been the experience I've had. I figured out that I'm non-binary partway through this book's production process. So my editor actually pulled the cover back, pulled the jacket back, so that I could get they them on. Like this is my first book that came out with my pronouns on it. So which has led to kind of funny stuff. I've talked a little bit about like my family for the most part does not know I'm non-binary. So like when I gave them copies of this book and they started looking toward the bio, I was like, oh no, look at the hardcover. Like look at what's on the inside, because I'm trying to distract them from this conversation that I'm not ready to have. Like I am willing to have it, just not yet. And I know that that's something that a lot of us are in that space of we're out online and we're not always out with everybody in real life. And I've had to, even though part of that is hard, I've had to sort of embrace the comedy of that sometimes. Like I have to laugh at it sometimes. Like my pronouns are they, them. I might be bi gender, like I said, still figuring this out with the whole like work in progress. But like I look like this half the time, and half the time I look like a 14-year-old skater boy. So I kind of have those two different modes. And of course, wouldn't you know it, like when my mother wants to FaceTime me, like mi madre calls when I look like a skater boy. So I do some of the like fastest Clark Kent, like gender changes, like put on the lace dress, let down the hair that you have ever seen, like the gender phone booth. Because like we're not all out everywhere, but we find spaces where people love us, where we find each other, we see each other. And I'm so grateful to have that. And I'm so grateful with the way that people have embraced my gender identity, especially considering that it took me a while to figure it out. Like I've written 4 books that have trans and non-binary main characters. And that's how long it took me to figure it out. I think our storyteller hearts just know things before we do sometimes. I'm married to a non-binary trans boy. He uses he/him pronouns. But he's also non-binary. So it was very easy for part of my brain to think like, I'm just writing about him. I'm writing about his gender identity, when in fact that's not the case. And he was just there kind of being like, okay, I'm going to be over here with all your other friends, like waiting for you to figure this out. But that's part of what we do. We're there for each other, however long that path takes. And I think one of the moments I had where I was trying, my storyteller heart was trying to tell me part of that was in in Blanca y Roja, where I'm writing about queerness, and I'm writing about murderous swans, because that's what you do in magical realism. You write about weird magic to talk about things that are hard to talk about. And I have this one chapter where the non-binary I can talk, I promise. Non-binary main character in this book, who uses he and she pronouns alternating, is talking about the ugly duckling, and says this is not a story about realizing you've become beautiful. This is a story about realizing that who you are is more beautiful than what you once thought you had to be. And I sort of hold that moment as trying to tell myself that it's okay. Like what I am is okay, and what I am is beautiful, even if it took me a couple of years to really hear that.
When you're talking about how like sometimes we like tell the truth through our art and we don't even know it, is I was reading a bunch of like old journal-ish diary entries that I had written in my early 20s. And in multiple of them, I said, I just don't feel like a guy. I don't feel like a guy. I don't like, and just being like, I don't relate to being a man, and why does everyone talk about me? I just, and like you, AJ, I had no language. That was not, I don't think I heard non-binary till probably, I don't know, like 7, 8 years ago. And so so I'm having these struggles where I'm like, I don't relate to this. I don't feel like this. And I was just absolutely telling on myself. I just had no idea, because I think we're in a world that tells us that these are the, like, I mean, that's the panel topic, beyond the binary. We're told these are the only things you can be. And I think also growing up believing that you are a cis gay man, there is so much beautiful gender expression you can do there, but it's always billed as like an expression, not an identity. And so I just thought the things that I'm feeling about myself, the things that I'm feeling about my body, I always thought it was dysmorphia, because that's very common in cis gay men. And it wasn't until probably like 4 or 5 years ago, when I was talking to a trans friend, where they were like, are you sure that's what's going on? Because all of this sounds really familiar. And I was like, no, that's not it. That's definitely not it. And they're like, are you sure? And then now look, like, yeah, they were right.
Yeah, for sure. And with me specifically, I had so many friends, and they were very well-meaning, but they kept saying, the longer you're on testosterone, the less you'll feel this way. You'll feel more like a man. And I said, okay, well, I'll give it. I gave it way longer than I totally should have, but I was being stubborn, I guess. But yeah, it never changed for me. I mean, certain things changed beyond hormones, of course, but the inherent identity that I always had remained the same. So I think that was telling. And sometimes it's just listen to yourself, you know yourself better than everyone else does. So
we sort of partition our brains in ways that help us survive. It's amazing what our brains can do. And I hope everybody watching sort of cuts themselves slack for that. And the fact that we do what we have to do to sort of take care of our hearts. I talked about, this has sort of been a work in progress for me. I basically lived as a guy for a couple of years as a teen, and still, because of bad things that happened, because of some of what I encountered, I pulled away from that so hard that I sort of pretended it didn't exist. And I think whether it's because bad things happen, or just because it's scary and it's unknown and it's sort of territory that's unfamiliar to us, I think a lot of us do that, and I hope we can all encourage each other to know that it's part of our journey, and that whatever we do in terms of ignoring stuff, it's not any kind of failing. It's us like taking care of our hearts as best we knew how to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's so much to be said just in terms of the way we see ourselves reflected in other things. And a lot of it, like Mark and Andrew were saying about, I didn't have the language yet, or I didn't have, you can recognize things in yourself that you can't quite identify yet. And it's funny because it's a universal human experience. It isn't just non-binary people who experience this. This is something that, when you're a kid, you don't know how to say, you don't know how to say something makes you uncomfortable. So you might say, oh, I'm afraid of this thing. And you're not actually like afraid. You don't know that word yet. And that's part of living and growing. And I think it's one thing that's really liberating that we've gotten really good at in the queer community is sort of accepting that we're all works in progress, like you guys have said, very much like no one is completely themselves ever. We're all constantly just figuring out how to be the best versions. So I think it's something you can play with really beautifully in literature, which actually kind of ties into the next question I had, which was, so I have, unfortunately, you do hear the narrative of kind of people outside the gender binary wanting to write a book that deals with being outside the gender binary and getting that pushback, whether it be from an agent or a publisher or even just other writers or readers, like, why is this relevant? Why is this important to the story? Why do you have to talk about gender when that's not what the story is about? And I was just wondering if you could each kind of talk a little bit about the way that we think of traditional storytelling and the way that making a story reflect the experience of being non-binary or any other gender identity aside from what one is assigned at birth, without that being the central focus of the story, and how that, it's kind of difficult to phrase, because I think it's always important, even when that's not what the story is about. But there are a lot of the time that's not the focus of the story, but it's still an important part of the story, I guess is what I'm saying. So if you could just comment on that, or kind of if you have any wisdom to sort of impart upon the kids who are listening.
Yeah, I'll try to take this one. It's a great question, but it's really multifaceted and large. But I think the important part for me was that I wanted to tell a story about a little ice skater, because I love reading skating books when I grew up. But gender touches on every aspect of your life, I feel like, even in like really tiny little ways. And I already mentioned some with respect to figure skating, but it's from the way people talk about you to other people when you're in front of them. And they're not trying to do it in a way that is harmful to you or anything. And they're probably not even aware if you're at the very beginning stages of your journey, but every aspect of your life is gendered in some way. My main character is also Jewish, so there was a couple mentions of an upcoming bat mitzvah, which is for girls, and bar mitzvahs are for boys. And the question, it wasn't like a huge theme within my story, but there was the question that came up: how do I deal with this? I can't pick one or the other if I'm neither, but I still want to go through this really important part in my life. So I think there are a lot of ways that you can touch on gender identity without making the story entirely about it, in just really natural and organic ways that come up in everyday life and in conversations with your friends and family. And just to make a note too, I think I've been very fortunate because I'm a debut author, so I'm fairly new to this, but I haven't had any pushback from anyone, probably because I hid for like 15 years thinking there's no way I'm ever going to publish anything because I didn't see anything on the shelves. But my agent's been very supportive, and my publisher too. My editor was so excited about getting to tell a story from a perspective that isn't her own either. And they've been very receptive to my feedback, specifically with how do we deal with pronouns on a character who hasn't made any decisions about them yet. So yeah, that's veering off a little bit, but that was my thought. It's just every kind of story is focused on something that isn't gender, but gender comes up in a lot of different contexts within those stories.
Oh, I relate to all of this so much. It's so interesting hearing people's, I think part of what's hard about this journey too is it's not just not having the language, but a lot of us just haven't had the chance, growing up, to just be around people who not just have wisdom or knowledge, but just are living an experience and getting to see it happen. And I think that's what's one of the beautiful things that's happening with literature right now is, I don't think a book is always necessary and a vehicle for empathy. I think sometimes it is just entertainment, and that's perfectly fine as well. But one of the great things, I did a school visit a couple months ago here in Brooklyn, and it was all digital, whatever. But there were a bunch of kids who were like, I don't understand this character. You don't call them a boy or a girl. And none of these students asking the question had ever heard the word non-binary. They didn't know that you could exist outside of male or female. And they weren't asking from a place of like this cruel, like you can tell when someone's being malicious versus someone who just is like, what? This concept has literally never entered my brain. And so I hadn't actually come out in the beginning of this meet. Like I just was like doing my thing. And so I was like, well, okay, I'm non-binary like this character. And they're like, wait, what? But you have a beard. And you're like, oh boy, this is going to be a journey. Like, you're like, okay, yes, but why do you automatically associate that a beard is with for men. And then you watch all their faces and they're like, because, and they're like, well, who told you that? And they're just like, and it's this interesting thing where you're actually watching that process break down of like, why do I associate this with this? And so I'm explaining to them, like, I don't exist on either end of this spectrum. I'm somewhere in between these two. And there are more than just the two. There are so many more. And it was great because this kid, you know, in that beautiful like thing was like, wait, I can just choose my gender and be that. And I was like, yeah. And they were so excited, like, wait, what? How many of them are there? Are they like Pokemon? And I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, it was just so pure. But like, I think, you know, to like get to the heart of the question, like, we have, I think there's so little, like, yes, we've been making strides, but there's still so little in terms of representation of outside the binary that right now we just need all of it, just as much of it as humanly possible. We need books that are directly about identity. We also need ones where it's a swashbuckling adventure. The main character happens to be non-binary, and it's in a world where there's no transphobia at all. Like, boom, it's never a conflict. There's no edge to it. They never worry about their identity. We need stuff that's extremely messy and weird and complicated, where a character thinks they know who they are and then they don't. You know, I think right now is the time where, you know, we need to write as much of it as possible, and publishers need to support as much of it as possible. So I think I think this conversation will change in 5 years, though. As more representation happens, then it becomes, well, what narratives is the market buying? What narratives are we giving to kids? Is it all pain? Because like, we're having that conversation very publicly now as a queer person, as a person of color. Like, we're at this point where we're like, oh, publishing only seems to want to buy trauma narratives. And I say that as someone who loves writing about trauma. Like, it's a very complicated thing. But I think right now, all of it, we need so much of it from every bit, adventure, contemporary, all of it. Just break the binary and everything.
I'll go off of something you said, Mark, about like, well, who told you that? Like, why is that necessarily the way it's supposed to be? And that's what I come to in a lot of different identity aspects that I write about. Whether I'm writing about being mixed race, writing about being trans and non-binary, writing about having a disability. So much of what we write about in terms of identity has to answer in some way, even if it's pushing against it. What has the world told you you're supposed to be? And that comes into play in most cases, no matter what your gender identity is. In Blanca y Roja, I have two cis girls who are very much grappling with, like, what have we been told as Latina girls, as girls of color? What have we been told our femininity needs to look like? Like, you are the bad girl and you are the good girl. And that's happening alongside this character who's non-binary and who's using alternating pronouns. So it's, so much of this comes down to what have we been told, and what have we been told so often that we forget to question it. That's part of why I love that moment that you're talking about, Mark, because it's stuff we get told so often, and it's stuff we get told so early that we forget that there are things we can question. And that happens too with other identity elements. I know that happens to me being Latinx. That happens to me thinking about being mixed race, and even realizing that I could use the word Latinx. Like, I didn't, even though it's a word that's more and more accepted, which is wonderful. It is not universally accepted, especially in our community. There is pushback against it. But realizing, like, I can use that word, and realizing that no matter who we are, we can question, and it is necessary to question what we have been told about how we must be and how we must live in the world.
So I think pretty much everyone kind of covered everything. And I think sort of with the exploration and where being non-binary or outside of the binary, or however we look at it, does come out in our work. With my debut, Jerkbait, I mean, one could look at it, the fact that they are identical twins, and you have Tristan, who's cis and straight, and Robbie, who's cis and gay. And very much, if you kind of just look at that, I think that might have been one of my ways that I tried to break in, or at least talk about things that were very difficult for me. And a lot of people I remember reached out who were twins, and they were shocked when they found out that I was an only child. They were just like, "How is that possible?" And it's like, there's these parts, and like, I get it. And then one of the things that also fueled me a little bit was it was a really extremely hurtful comment from some people within the community. Someone had done a really wonderful book review of Jerkbait, and then there were all of these threads on Twitter and comments there saying that it was just queer baiting, and that I was like this cis straight person who was taking advantage of the community because I didn't have it on my website and because I didn't have it in my Twitter bio. And it was so hurtful, and I got angry. And I know I keep mentioning that I don't write happy books in general. Like it's weird. Like I absolutely agree that it needs to be all of it, because also there's all sorts of teens and also preteens and kids. You know, they need a whole big spectrum of what to choose. Some people need the really happy escapism where everything really is okay, because you need to have that sort of hope. And then some people are going through a lot of issues, a lot of things that are hurting them. And then they want to know, oh, look, this is how this character negotiated that. Or like, oh, look, this isn't just my experience. And then with somebody told me again, mostly not for adult fiction. I do thrillers and suspense stuff there. But when it's young adult, I've noticed that all of my best writing has come when I've gotten really, really furious. It's an expression I don't have often. And then somebody told me, originally writing that because I was really, really angry and everything except, and I was so thrilled. My agent was so wonderful, and he's such a cool guy. And my editor, even the first phone call was like, I had never heard the term bigender before. But I went and I did as much research as possible, and I'm ready to learn, and the whole publisher is ready to learn, which was amazing. I feel that's huge progress. And with somebody told me because of that, and it's learner, it's sort of bigender 101. And it very much is that you're learning some of those things, but with also talking about representation and who we are. Alex/Alexis is also Russian Jewish and agnostic. And for the Russian Jewish part, that's something that stands out to me. That is most of my heritage. That's mostly the way I identify. And it's strange because when you talk about race and ethnicity in general, people who are Russian Jewish are in a category called other. It's basically not white, but not people of color. And one of the reasons why it's not recognized is because of the amount of anti-Semitism that exists. And basically that is giving ammunition for people to hurt us. But what's difficult then is the last thing that I know I'm veering off a little bit, but the last thing that I've seen anyone, who's, Jewish in terms of ethnicity and race wants, we do not want to go and impede on people of color, especially because we don't want to go and hurt them and take away their marginalizations and stomp over it. At the same time, we are not accepted as white. I can't tell you how many times I was stopped on the street and people would just start calling me a commie the second they would see it, or like all these Jewish comments. When I went to Australia to meet my now husband for the first time, people refused to shake my hand. Like it was just this really super white area. They refused to shake my hand, and I didn't understand it at all. It was like, what happened? And it's one of those really strange things. So sometimes I think being outside of those boxes and sliding it in, writing about something where I knew the whole book was bigender 101, and it's like, okay, but maybe I can write a little bit about being Russian Jewish and then have two characters be it. Why not have two? And then like, hey, I haven't read as much stuff about agnostic characters. That would be great to do that. And especially in a book where it does have very heavy criticism about religion, to go and actually have someone that's agnostic and still open. So I think it seeps in. It depends on how you look at it. And then just for readers in general, I just ask you sometimes to be kind when there are books that are outside of the binary, so to speak, or something else. Some people might not be able to say certain pronouns for protection or identity. They might not be able to do that. I think when you read something, though, it's really obvious. Like when you read it, you know when there's the heart, you can kind of tell. And I think that a lot of people sort of stem from this jealousy and then really look for ways to tear people down. So I would just ask readers to, you know, be kind. And if something brings is really authentic and the author hasn't said anything, consider that maybe they're just not at that point yet. And it might take them a few years. And if there's this, you know, tweet brigade against it, that might really, you know, do some detrimental stuff, not just for the author, but also for other readers who maybe did identify with that too. So, I don't know. I know I rambled off a little bit, but the too long didn't speak, I guess it would be. Not funny at all. You know, it seeps in. I think it's important, and to allow yourself to do that. And for a lot of times, I feel that publishing, especially with young adult and children's fiction in general, I feel like it's starting to get way more accepted. They're starting to understand it. The editors seem way more cool. So I think that for like teen writers and upcoming writers, I think that you have a lot of opportunities that many people did not have 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, more than that. So I feel that I honestly believe that in a couple of years, it's going to be a non-issue whatsoever. I think that, I don't know, I would guess that would be probably 8 years, stuff like that. And I think it won't be an issue by then. And yes, I am very specific about years.
That was very good. 8 years. I
mean, 8 years, that's my guess.
And I think you touched on something really important, and just in the idea of it's not necessarily just Twitter, but I think in the book community and the Kidlit community, especially, we see it a lot of the time where Twitter can kind of serve as this really unifying front, because like I make jokes all the time with my family, like, oh, you don't get it, I'm gayer on Twitter, or, you know, it's a lot easier to kind of be open in yourself in this platform because you feel safe. And because of that, you know, now and then you do see people get sort of attacked in a way that isn't, you know, it's never fair to assume anything about anyone's gender identity. And that's never cool. Just because, you know, somebody doesn't have it on their book jacket doesn't mean it's not the case. And a lot of the time people don't feel safe or comfortable coming out on a book jacket versus, you know, Twitter, where it's safe and fun and everyone's happy and gay all the time. It's like 24/7 pride. But I think that it's also been a really good asset for the publishing community, not to get into anything like too specific or kind of, you know, grimy details, but there have definitely been situations where statistics in publishing are made, you know, clearer because of a viral tweet or something, where it's like, oh, well, you know, we have a lot of cis white women who just run publishing. And to be able to kind of air that out too and have that in the open. So I think in a lot of ways it can be like a blessing and a curse, because, you know, it's good to be open and honest, but sometimes we can take it a little too far and become judgmental, which is the exact opposite of what we want to be. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And I'm also really glad you and Anna Marie both kind of touched on this idea of intersectionality in writing, specifically because, you know, if you're going to write beyond the binary, so to speak, kind of taking yourself away from this idea that there's one and there's the other, and, you know, just getting out of that kind of this or mindset, there's a lot of ways where that plays in outside of just gender, you know. So to talk about being, you know, mixed race, or having, you know, maybe like your gender identity and your, you know, like your sexual orientation are different and don't necessarily align in the way that traditionally they would, or, you know, maybe you come even like family structures. I'm finding more and more young adult books and middle grade books will have like mixed family structures. And I'm like, oh, that's so interesting and great, because, you know, that wasn't something you saw as much when I was growing up. And I think with each, as we're talking about, kind of each generation is going to get it a little bit more and a little bit more. So I was just wondering how you all kind of take intersectionality and take being non-binary or outside of the gender binary, and kind of make those kind of harmonize, I guess, together.
You know, with my fiction, and it's the case, you know, I have my middle grade debut is out next year. I'm hoping, you know, I have a YA book that is into my publishing house, and I hope they like it or whatever. My thing is that whatever I'm writing about, I center queer people of color, period. Because we historically have been excluded from publishing. We historically have been excluded from the page. And this is my little way of saying we've always been here and we're going to continue to be here. So just by default, you know, my books are going to look a little different and behave a little differently, and hopefully get away from, you know, like I especially with Each of Us a Desert, I'm thinking about how do I get away from traditional sort of European archetypical fantasy, and how do I get away from what is expected of a fantasy book, what is expected of a contemporary book. Like what are the ways that I can, you know, get away from what is expected. I think it's we've been talking about like what is the great things that we can do to sort of like write ourselves, write our identities or whatnot. But I think the other aspect of this too is that I think it's also about learning. I think that writing beyond the binary is helping me to learn, because, you know, so there's like this sort of subplot through Each of Us a Desert, because I first started like really seriously coming out probably about 3 or 4 years ago to people. And I got this really weird reaction, which is I would tell people, hey, I identify as non-binary. If you could update your like internal chart in your head for me with they and start using they, them for me, that would be great. And immediately people were like, oh, you're now a resource and I can ask you all of these questions about being trans or being non-binary. And I was like, oh, no. I didn't, it's not like I chose non-binary and then the entirety of the world's knowledge of being not cis got entered into my brain and I can now tell it to you. I was like, no, I'm still unlearning so many things in the world. And it became this thing where there's this immense pressure to sort of perform knowledge and perform wisdom as someone who is non-binary. And I was like, no, I have messed up recently. Like, and I'm going to continue messing things up because I have to deprogram literal decades of like misinformation and wrong knowledge, like all of this stuff. You know, and I think one way that I'm doing that is purposefully, you know, paying attention to what I write in books, or what I write about books, because I still run a review blog. And I don't think, you know, I think, you know, to sort of address what you're talking about, I think one way to do that is to be specific. And in the end, I think that's what, when we're talking about intersectionality as a theory, you know, and particularly how Kimberly Crenshaw initially intended it, is what is the lived experience and what is the experience under our society that differs when multiple identities intersect. And the non-binary character in Anger is a Gift is not what people expect. I think there's this expectation that if you're like, what does a non-binary person look like? There's sort of this really, which just blows my mind, that people are like, okay, we finally have this wonderful term that can describe this community. And they're like, a non-binary person is an androgynous white person with short hair. And I'm just like, no, that's not, no. You're falling right into like,
always skinny. They're really skinny with the short hair. Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. And then, you know, what that ends up happening is it ends up being very detrimental to people like me who will never look like that. I will never, there's no way I can look like that. And I don't want to. I love my beard. I love my skin color. I love being brown. Like, I love being who I am. That's not an ideal for me to get to. And so one of the things that I hope to do is that by writing as many non-binary characters who have all these other intersecting identities and experiences is to just expand what the concept of a non-binary person is. It doesn't have to be one thing. And I just want, I want that freedom. I want a kid who doesn't look like what they think a, you know, who doesn't fit like a specific mold or a specific look. I want them to still have the freedom to be like, oh, I relate to this. This is me. This is what I go through. This is what I'm feeling or whatever. And so I think of that when I write. I think how, you know, how can you challenge yourself and get yourself further out of these sort of like very biological essentialism, cis-centric views of the world? And then also, how can you put that in a book and make sure that the stuff you're putting out into the world is responsible and isn't harmful?
But I think when I think about intersectionality, it's a word that I learned that was sort of like, oh, this reflects what I know about life. This reflects what I am, what's just sort of normal to me. I'm queer. I now know I'm non-binary. I didn't at the time when I first heard the word intersectionality, but I'm brown, I'm mixed race, I'm Latinx. I also have a disability. I have a learning disability. And when I think about these different things and why it, for one thing, it's important for us to be able to see those different aspects of ourselves and see that we are all one person. We're not breaking up different elements of our identity. This is all, we are all these things at once. You're not pulling them out of yourself. And I think the reason that particular imagery comes to mind is that I think a lot of us feel pressure to sort of break our identities down into consumable bite-sized pieces for people. And if that's because you're only ready to address a certain aspect of your identity, that's one thing. We all have our process. We come out when we come out. We understand ourselves when we understand ourselves. And that is a deeply personal process. And your timing for that is yours. But choosing your timing and choosing how you talk about something is different than this pressure we get sometimes where, like, I'm thinking of, I don't want to list out specific examples because they're hateful, but people will list different identities in a row as like a joke, as oh, someone is this. Like they'll say it as a joke, like it's some kind of like after school special joke they can make. And I'm like, no, like everything you just said, like that's a person, that's not a person, that's a lot of us. So being able to recognize that this is who we are, and yes, there are hard things about it, and a lot of us deal with trauma, but we have joy in our identities. We have joy in the intersections of our identities. So your process of how you talk about it is yours, and you decide when you talk about it. But also, I hope that there's sort of that understanding of like you decide. And that is a different thing than the world saying, hey, you're too many things at once. Because I think we get that pushback sometimes, whether we're talking about it in stories or whether we're just talking about ourselves and who we are. But so it's wonderful that we have these different identities, and we are who we are, and we are real people where different communities come together, and that's a beautiful thing. And I think a lot of us know that. If you're tuning in here, I'm guessing that's what you think. But unfortunately, a lot of the world doesn't think that. So I'm glad that we have a community that does recognize the beauty in that.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to intersecting identities too, sometimes we are more comfortable being public about certain aspects of our identities sooner than others. So I've been pretty open about my trans and non-binary status for several years, but it's been only maybe a month or two since I added that I'm autistic as well on my Twitter bio. And I told my agent, and my editor also knows, because I thought that was important to mention up front, especially because in the past I'd heard don't say anything about X part of your identity because they'll think you're like hard to work with or something. And I thought, well, I don't know if I really want to work with someone who isn't going to be able to accommodate like basic parts of my identity. So I think looking at stories as well, I mean, every single person is different. And in terms of even being non-binary, the different intersections of your identity impact being non-binary in different ways. So in my story, my main character, Anna, is from a single parent home and is in a really expensive city in San Francisco. And the mom's, trying to handle this very expensive sport that her kid is, excelling in. So part of the reason that Anna doesn't immediately come out as non-binary when she receives this very gendered figure skating program to start training is because, mom spent a lot of money on this and it would ruin our lives in some ways if I had to start over and my mom had to pay for more choreography and stuff. So maybe I can just keep this to myself for a while and figure out how to come out later, but then it starts eating at her. So I think depending on what our different intersectionalities are, they have the ability to impact even like in stories, like the main storyline of coming out would be different if my character had come from a wealthy two-parent home. So I think the more nuance we put into these stories, the more opportunities kids have to see themselves, at least in one portion of a character's identity. And it might build some empathy for, you know, maybe a non-binary upper middle class reader might get some empathy for someone who doesn't have the same kind of privilege, financial privilege as they do, or vice versa. So that's why I try to do it in my stories.
Absolutely. And I think that's completely just like a beautiful premise. And I'm so excited to read On the Edge now because that, like, I was excited anyway, but just that additional detail, like, it made my heart explode. Okay, so I have like a quick final question to kind of like leave off on a cheery note, if that's okay with you guys. Awesome. Okay, so final question for the evening. And again, thank you guys so much for doing this and letting me do this with you. I've had such an amazing time talking with you all. So this is kind of more for the audience, but I would assume a lot of the kids tuning in have an interest in writing in some form or another. You know, maybe they want to write full novels or poetry, or maybe they're musicians or anything like that. So writing in sort of the more general sense of the world and creating and being artistic. What advice do you have for any young people and young creatives tuning in who want to live outside the binary and have that reflected in their art?
Oh my God. Because I'm so used to the question of like, what advice do you have for kids? But it's never actually the specific, so I didn't have like a ready answer to go. I would say, I think one of the best parts about getting to challenge the binary is actually the joy, the fun of it. Like getting to realize like, wait, I don't have to gender this in this specific way. I don't think I did it in like a fully complete sense in the way that I wanted to, but there's a lot of Spanish in Each of Us a Desert, and getting to rethink how Spanish was gendered was super fun, where I was just like, oh my God, what if everything's feminine? And as much as I could get away with, because then there was like when you get into like the colonized languages, there's so much gross gendering and it's so hard to pull it out. But finding those moments where I could not gender something and just being super excited, like, oh, this works, like this works, and this is a thing, and then maybe this is a thing that can carry on in other ways. And like that joy is infectious. And so I would say, as you're creating and rethinking your worlds and rethinking the people that are in your worlds, have fun with it. It is okay to have fun while also completely smashing the patriarchy and the gender binary.
Yeah, I'd say like playing off what Mark said too, just write what you like. Don't write what someone else you think they want to read, because I was doing that for years thinking, what will get me published? Well, I don't think this non-binary main character is going to get me published because I haven't seen it before. But if you write your truths, I think it gets conveyed to other readers and they know how genuine that is. And there has been a growth of inclusivity in publishing lately. So if your goal is to get published, don't take yourself out of the running just because you haven't seen it out there yet. And if your goal is just to have fun writing, definitely don't write what you think other people think you should write. Just have fun. I think I heard on another virtual conference recently, someone said, write your heart trash. And that really resonated with me. So I would say like, yeah, I can't remember exactly who said that. So, but it wasn't me, so I don't want to take credit, but yeah, write what you love, what excites you, and what gets you motivated to get in front of your computer or in front of a notebook every day. That's all you really can do.
I love all of this. I think something I would add is to just a reminder that like we belong everywhere. Like non-binary identity belongs in the world as we know it, the world as we experience it. We have been here throughout history. We belong in fantasy worlds. We belong on spaceships. Like we belong everywhere. So we can go everywhere, and we should.
Fanfic. Fanfic is the way to do that. It's one of the safest ways. And you would be shocked at how many published authors either started by writing fanfic or have their secret fanfic accounts. Not that I would know anything about secret fanfic accounts, but sometimes it's easier when you're starting to learn about it to omit the pressure from yourself, because fanfic, you can't get published with that. You know, you don't have the pressure of publication, and you can really learn how to write. You know, one thing that stood out to me, especially with Andrew and everything about the figure skating, is that anime Yuri on Ice, and there was Georgi Popovich, and then one of the things that stood out is it's like, well, Russian's a very gendered language, but to compete wearing what would be considered more a female skating costume and the point deductions with even white skates for one of the outfits too, it's like there's a lot of ways to look into it. So fanfic, and then what everyone else said, because they're a lot more sophisticated than me, but fanfic.
Okay, I love that. And I guess if I, as a moderator, I will impart my moderation wisdom, which is that you are more than just a label. You are every moment you have lived and every moment you're going to live, and there is no one word that can capture an entire person, and you should always embrace every weird, hard to define part of yourself in your writing, and you shouldn't get caught up in the details. If you don't know exactly who you are, who you want to be yet, don't let that stop you. And that's my piece. So okay, thank you guys so much for being here. I'm Alex Abraham. You can find me on Twitter at Alex_ABE Abe _. I am a children's bookseller and book fan.
I'm Mark Oshiro. You can find me at Mark Does Stuff anywhere on the internet. That's my name everywhere. And my first book is currently out. It's called Anger is a Gift. And then my second book comes out September 15th called Each of Us a Desert.
I'm Anna Marie McLemore. My pronouns are they, them. My latest book is Dark and Deepest Red, and you can find me on Twitter at La Anna Marie, L-A Anna Marie.
I am Andrew Sass, writing under AJ. My debut novel is Anna on the Edge. It's out on October 20th. And you can find me pretty much anywhere online at Matoka, which is Matokah.
I'm Mia Siegert. You can find my handle online at Mia Siegert everywhere. Somebody told me just came out in April, and we believe it's the first traditionally published young adult with a bi-gender protagonist. So I hope that you would maybe consider giving my book a little bit of a try. And just thank you for having me on the panel with such amazing, incredible people.
And thank you for moderating, Alex. Thank you.
Thank
you.
It was a pleasure.